Welcome back, everybody. Bringing it back to the foundation today. Ground zero of what we call reggae. Tune called "Oh Carolina" by the Folks Brothers. Pay particular attention to that drumming and the percussion. Recorded around 1959 by the late and produced by the late great Prince Buster. "Oh Carolina" was a landmark in the very early days of the Jamaican recording industry, which to that point was either relying on American records brought over from America, typically in the rhythm and blues style, or recorded by local artists, basically copying that rhythm and blues style. Producers like Prince Buster wanted to bring something new to the table, wanted to bring in a bit of a different style, more authentically Jamaican, more ethnically Jamaican, representing the people of the island maybe a little closer than something imported from overseas. To do this, he wanted an inexperienced group. I think the Folks Brothers, who had never recorded before, had that raw sound he wanted. They were, by the way, a group of 3 brothers. I think they split up soon after these sessions, and one of the brothers later settled in Canada, from what I understand, lived there for many years. Might have become a professor or something, I think I read somewhere. Prince Buster, to give the record with the Folks Brothers, "Oh Carolina," this somewhat folk or mento flavored Jamaican folk song, he wanted to bring in the drums of Count Ossie and his troupe of Rastafarian drummers. Count Ossie, or Oswald Williams as he was born in the 1920s, was a master Rastafarian drummer who had been taught to drum by what was called a Burru man called Brother Job. The Burru men were sort of a traveling minstrel class, lived on the very fringes of Jamaican society, and practiced a form of drumming directly brought over from West Africa and passed down through the generations. He was also influenced by a West African spirit religion called Kumina, which had its own drumming traditions. And these 2 strains, Ossie kind of blended together to form what became known as Nyabinghi drumming. The Naya man is another name for the Rasta man, or the Rastafarian, and a bingi is the name of a gathering. An alternative name for a Nyabinghi, where the Rastas would gather, play drums, chant, often sing songs, sometimes adapted from gospel standards, just kind of free-flowing gatherings of the tribes. Another name would be called grunation, or grounding of the nation. It's a spiritual grounding in these ceremonies. And these Nyabinghi drums are sacred drums. They were usually played unamplified out in the hills, in the gatherings of the Rastafarians, or in the slums like Bakawal, the Dungle, where Count Ossie had first encountered these Burru men and learned the African drum traditions passed down from the slaves. He was also influenced by the records of Babatunde Olatunji, similarly reviving those African drum traditions and presenting them in a new way for modern audiences. Count Ossie would record on various names as the Afro Combo, various other names, would perform live. Prince Buster had known about him for a while, had followed his music, got the idea to bring him in on this record. At this time, that was a very controversial notion. Jamaican society, which was very informed by the British aesthetic, British colonial education aesthetic, which presented anything European as the highest cultural value. They didn't necessarily want anything to do with those kind of drumming traditions. Some of these Rastafarian drummers were discouraged from playing. Their parents would rather have seen them play the piano or some other European instrument. But the drum traditions experienced this revival through the movement of Rastafari, which had begun in the 1930s with the crowning of Haile Selassie, as otherwise known as Rastafari, crowned Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, in 1930. The great Jamaican civil rights leader Marcus Garvey was reported to have prophesied, "Look to the east for the coming of a black king, for the sign of his ascension will mean deliverance for the black race." So the crowning of Haile Selassie was seen as the fulfillment of that prophecy, which no one is 100% sure Marcus Garvey ever actually uttered those words, but it was attributed to him. Early Rastafarian leaders like Leonard Howell and others brought this message of Haile Selassie as the returned Messiah, as basically God made flesh to walk the earth and deliver the black race out of bondage, and brought it to the island of Jamaica as a reaction to the Christian church, which had always presented the image of a white deity to a black nation. And this Rastafarian religion, or movement as it became known, would offer an alternative to that very Eurocentric rendition of faith and deliverance. So the Rastafarian movement flourished throughout the 1930s into the 40s, gained more and more converts. Leaders like Leonard Howell established a commune called Pinnacle in the 1950s, which was eventually raided by police. There was a very confrontational attitude with the authorities, who looked very much looked down on this movement with its drums, with its use of ganja. In the 1950s, the wearing of dreadlocks became part of the movement, and it presented an even more intimidating image of dread, of the Blackheart man, as they were sometimes disparaged as, and attributed to all kinds of crimes and offenses against society. Nonetheless, the Rastafari flourished. Count Ossie was one of these early converts to Rastafari. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the movement was gaining more strength, and Prince Buster thought Count Ossie and his drums would be the perfect element to bring into this recording studio. Count Ossie at first had no interest in setting foot in a recording studio. That to him was Babylon, or the outside world, opposed to the goals of Rastafari. But Prince Buster eventually prevailed on him after much persistence. They brought the troupe into the recording studio at JBC Studios. They had to use a small upstairs room. Prince Buster had some studio space booked in the main studio, but there was a bit of underhandedness as Duke Reid double booked the studio to try and force Prince Buster out. The ever continuing rivalry between various sound men. Duke Reid, one of the more aggressive. Basically, some of the session musicians even were resistant to Prince Buster bringing these drummers in. They didn't quite know how to mesh with these very African drums. This has never been heard before on a record. Certainly wasn't going to be played on the radio. But Prince Buster had faith in his idea. Duke Reid laughed out loud at the dreadlocked Rastafarian drummers coming into the studio. The tune, when it was recorded, proved a smash, and when Prince Buster played it at a dance against Duke Reid, reportedly flopped Duke Reid's sound, or defeated him. The crowds gravitated to Buster's sound. Even radio resisted playing it at first, but eventually had to give in. The tune was a sensation and kind of a ground zero of a more Jamaican style of music, which would eventually continue on through ska and into what we now know as reggae. Count Ossie, meanwhile, after that initial reluctance to record in the studio, would go on to work for Cox and Dodd's Studio One, cutting various sides under various names like the Mellow Cats, Count Ossie and the Warikas. These kind of names would also work for producer Harry Moody. In the late 1960s, around 1970-ish, Count Ossie and his troupe merged with another group called the Mystics, which were led by Jamaican saxophone player Cedric M. Brooks, who had also recorded for Studio One, was one of these great Jamaican horn players who had come out of the Alpha Boys School training ground. He was a very free jazz influenced. I think he had almost joined Sun Ra's troupe at one point in America. But Cedric Brooks had his own group called the Mystics. He was very interested in exploring the different avenues of Jamaican music and all the different strains from mento to rocksteady, ska, and merging them into something new, merging them with free jazz through his saxophone playing. These two groups merged with Count Ossie and Cedric Brooks's group merged to form what was called the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari, and put out in 1973 an iconic album called Gru Nation. This is original press on the Ashanti label out of the UK with this incredible sleeve artwork. I'll try and show you this here. 1973 triple LP, maybe the first, certainly the first triple LP in Jamaican music at that time, maybe the only. The Mystic Revelation of Rastafari, an attempt to capture on record one of these Rastafarian grunations or gatherings of drumming, spiritual orations, songs, chanting, just the free-flowing vibes. Beautiful cover art. Grunation by the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari. I'll show you the label there quickly. Triple LP set. And an iconic album of Jamaican music, Count Ossie and the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari. This would be followed a couple of years later by a further set, Tales of Mozambique, attempting to tell in music the history of the black man in the West Indies, from the slave trade to a new life in the West Indies as a very much a visitor to this hemisphere. Count Ossie and the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari, further classic set. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, Count Ossie was killed in a car crash. The Mystic Revelation has continued on in various incarnations. I think Count Ossie's son currently leads them, or has led them for many years. Cedric Brooks, meanwhile, would continue his own explorations of Jamaican music, using the Rastafarian drumming, the Nyabinghi drumming as one part of the fabric, but also weaving in different threads to create what he wanted to call third world music. He had put out an album, very poor, this is only a CDR, very poor reproduced cover here. It has been reissued since this. Have to get a copy. Cedric Brooks and the Divine Light, a new group, from mento to reggae to third world music, doing just as it says, exploring mento, which was the Jamaican form of calypso, ska, rocksteady, all the different styles, and merging them in with free jazz to create what he envisioned, Cedric Brooks envisioned as a new style of music. Further albums with the Divine Light, which would rename themselves The Light of Saba, would continue in this vein. A mix of free jazz and Rastafarian drumming. Honest Johns several years ago put out a nice compilation. Cedric M. Brooks and The Light of Saba. His nickname M is the Jamaican corruption of him, as in they were in the studio one day and they said, get him to play. So that stuck as his nickname, M, one of the great Jamaican horn players, sax players. There's also some 12 inches issued on Honest John's records, The Light of Saba, a tune called Lamb's Bread Cully, celebrating the herb, as well as Africa and Sabebe. And these are culled from albums that the Divine Light of Saba made, albums like The Light of Saba itself, The Light of Saba in Reggae, and Sabebe. There were other drummers bringing that kind of style of Rastafarian drumming into the studio. The obscure group Mabrak put out a rare album called Drum Talk. This is a reissue on the Dugout label. Mabrak, Drum Talk. This was recorded at Harry J's studio. Mabrak was another group which was bringing the Rastafarian style of drumming into the studio. Rhythms used here include Liquidator, the great Liquidator, produced by the Harry J All-Stars. But probably the most famous exponent of the Rastafari style of drumming was Michael Henry, aka Ras Michael, who had formed a group sometimes called the Sons of Negus, or the churchical host of the Sons of Negus, some variation of that in the 1960s. Again, Rastafarian drumming troupe, much like Count Ossie's. He had been, Michael Henry had been grown up in Rastafari his whole life, basically, learned those drumming techniques, was a master drummer already. They put out in the early 70s a series of albums. This is Freedom Sounds, just credited to the Sons of Negus. And strictly drumming, accented with the guitar of Earl Chinna Smith. That appeared on Byron Lee's Dynamic label. Early 1970s, 1974-ish. Strictly Nyabinghi drumming and guitar, skeletal kind of guitar licks. Also recording as Dadawa, Ras Michael put out the essential Peace and Love. I believe Dadawa means peace and love. This is a reissue. Originally came out on the Wildflower label, produced by Lloyd Charmers. Dadawa, Peace and Love, almost psychedelic, trance-inducing African Rastafarian drumming with a full band this time. The drums of Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus, this time credited as Dadawa, alternative name. And a further set came out around the same time. These albums are all around 1974, 1975. Nyabinghi, putting the name on an LP. Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie on the cover. And this appeared in the UK on the Trojan label, original. Ras Michael, again, full band on here. And Rise Jaja Children, reworking the old The Lion Sleeps Tonight song, the old South African tune, folk tune I believe it was. Also got the reissue on Sunspot label from a few years ago. Ras Michael would continue recording through the 1970s, with Rastafari itself appearing a couple of years later. This one is on the Gru Nation label in the UK. Again, Gru Nation, Nyabinghi, basically the same thing, gathering of Rastafari. That's His Imperial Majesty himself as a young boy. Rastafari Makonnen. Later 70s album, Love Thy Neighbor by Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus was partly recorded at Lee Perry's Black Ark studio. It was not completed. Lee Perry was in a precarious mental state at that time. The Black Ark would soon be destroyed. Ras Michael apparently had to go in there and rescue the completed tapes and complete the album elsewhere. But what remained definitely has some of that Black Ark ambience. And a later one, live set, 1980, Promised Land Sounds. This has been reissued fairly recently. This is an original. This is actually released out of my area on Lionsgate Records, out of Vancouver, Canada. His Imperial Majesty, Haile Selassie, Empress Menen. And this was partly produced by George Barrett, longtime local reggae radio host, been on the air since 1976, 1977. I've met him once or twice, grew up, kind of got into reggae listening to him, and also Alex Brajgart, aka Alex Ilox, worked with Yabby U, knew him very well. He lives not too far away from me. A friend of mine has met him. We've been trying to arrange a meeting. Hopefully it happens soon. So that is my introduction to the sacred drumming of Nyabinghi and its very spiritual place in Jamaican music. Sacred drumming. Hopefully this goes some way to explaining a part of the Rastafari's relationship with reggae and with reggae music and with Jamaica. So cheers. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.